The project that this was based on was before I came to Birmingham, and the three of us, one of us brought a social movement perspective to the project. One very much an institutional perspective about the state and new forms of the state. And one, and you can guess which one this is, a more kind of cultural constructionist perspective. And those three clashed terribly. And we never worked them through. And I think the tensions show in the book, but they're productive tensions, and ones which live with me. And I think one of the key moments was trying to articulate that social movement perspective against a governance perspective and seeing what happened as a result. So I'll stop there.
All right, I mean, I'll have to pick up the governance theme again there, because when asked about how citizenship fits into a project that basically has looked at and continues to look at how security is not a property, something that you have or don't have, but is fundamentally about a certain method or methods of governing, particular ways of how does security differ as a practice from economic governance and so on. And doing that in relation to free movement, and the question is, what does that have to do with citizenship? And so it means that citizenship can't come in, first of all, as in terms of political participation, empowering, these kinds of questions. Neither does it come in, first of all, as a question of identity, because security is not primarily about identity, it's about a method of governance. So it's not about loyalties and so on. But it first of all comes in as something that's tied in with the question of mobility and the way you govern through the constitution of and the regulation of mobility. That's also why this kind of security analysis differs from the way Engin introduced it, because it doesn't primarily look at the immigrant or the migrant or the asylum seeker or the trafficked or the illegal immigrant from the perspective as the excluded. It takes an internal view of how one constitutes free movement through security as a practice, as a method of governance. And so it's much more tied in with mobility. Now, as it happens to be the case, this connection is explicit in the European Union, where on the one hand, one has, of course, this whole struggle about the democratic deficit and defining what is a European citizen and how can you make Europe something that speaks, the European integration process, to its people, the people's Europe. At the same time, citizenship is not defined in these terms. That's a function of it, but it was formally defined as freedom of movement across the European space, which does not simply mean that border controls are abolished, but also that resident permits, employment opportunities, all these elements, recognition of diplomas across borders, that's what constitutes the free movement. That's how citizenship is defined. That ties it, of course, in directly with the other method of governance that is so central to the European integration process, which is economic governing, creating an internal market. And so you got this nexus. Now, at the moment one starts accelerating this idea that Europe is made out of citizens who can move freely across the European Union space, one also sees suddenly a rise in security as an issue within the EU. From the moment on one starts abolishing internal border controls, one gets a whole apparatus and the involvement of home offices, justice, and so on, in constituting a spillover effect. What does it mean when we get rid of internal border controls and we facilitate free movement? Don't we have then to control all the bad guys as well who can enjoy this free movement? Now that seems to be logic, but that was constructed in a kind of very political way, among others through a shift from foreign policy people or professionals to home affairs professionals in the Schengen Agreement. So there's all kinds of things going on. But what's important here is that the European integration process became an internal security project. The most successful security project in the European integration process has nothing to do with the foreign and security policy, which is always moving forward and backward in small steps. But they have been very successful institutionalizing an internal security remit, which is now officially recognized under the area for freedom, security and justice. And so it's there that security is, and that raises a question about how citizenship, how the governing through and giving shape through mobility and by shaping mobility is actually embedded in, and what role do policing technologies, surveillance technologies play in this, in actually shaping the European Union what it is, which means that you have a question about the relationship between democratic governance, economic governance, and then this internal security as a method of governing as well. And I think this bears upon much. It leads to another perspective on how security is mostly discussed at the moment within the member states as well as within the European Union, where it's of course the big question about liberty versus security, which is as if you're actually trading off or trying to reconcile two properties or two rights. That's not how it is. Security is a peculiar, but only a peculiar method of governing what this freedom actually means and how freedom as elements of mobility become institutionalized. And it's a completely different ball game in one way, in one sense, but not unrelated to the liberty-security debates.
Okay, thanks, Jef. Paul?
Yes, thank you. Well, my work is also concerned with what happens in the European space and the nature of that space. My particular interest is in the impact of EU enlargement on the new member states of Central and Eastern Europe and their party politics. And this impinges on general notions of citizenship in various ways. Firstly, the new member states themselves become citizens in a corporatist sense of an enlarged and reconstituted Europe, which increasingly stands for Europe in general nowadays. So the states obviously have this sort of formal priority, but also EU membership means a new citizenship status for individual members, the people in those countries, the citizens of the states themselves. And this can obviously be seen in terms of new processes of mobility, and I won't mention chickens and turkeys here, but we could mention that. Job opportunities for people that have more definite civic rights, and of course, you see large numbers of East Europeans, Latvians, Lithuanians, Poles in particular, throughout our streets and job places of work. So, considerable impact already on new citizenship rights and new members of those societies, and also the material benefits, not unimportant at all, which sort of flow to those countries derived from membership of the enlarged community in terms of structural funds, common agricultural policy, etc. Rather boring things like this, but which kind of things which can have quite a bit of impact on people's lives. So that's another form of citizenship, the individuals, the states. But in fact, in certain sense, my primary focus is on the role of parties as formal political institutions, who also themselves, with enlargement, become institutional citizens in a rather specific form, for example, that is essentially the parties who become representing citizens, but also representing themselves in the European Parliament, and also gaining new rights, forming part of European party federations and party groupings. Rather interestingly, though perhaps not terribly well known to most people here, but interesting to me, is the contentious aspects of this process over the past year, for example, with the membership of the new Central East European countries. For the first time, the European federations are having to sort of sit back and say, well, what is a European political party? What are its values? So it goes back to the question of identity. In fact, we can link these themes. The accretion of the new East European members faces the European community as a whole, not just with its sort of institutional hiatus in terms of the constitutional treaty, etc., but also what does it mean to be European? So the whole identity question is there in quite a big, dramatic sense. And it occurs also in the more specific area I'm concerned with in terms of the party federations. For example, for the first time in its history, the Parliamentary Socialist Group suspended the Slovak Social Democrats because they were allying with a rather unsavoury group of extremist nationalists, and that's sort of in abeyance, which sort of forces them to look to what does it mean to be a democratic socialist in Europe, for example. And equally, one of the somewhat unsavoury developments in party politics in the European Union is the formation of a new extreme right group, with the exception of Bulgaria and Romania, who provide the requisite number of extreme rightists to form that group. I'll just mention that the leading group is the French National Front. The British affiliate of that, they don't have any members in terms of, there's a general affiliation with the British National Party. So you can imagine what kind of grouping that is likely to be. So that does raise the question of what is a legitimate political party, what are the legitimate values that parties can and should pursue within the institutional structure of this modern Europe. So that's an identity aspect that fits in with citizenship as well. I should also mention, fairly obviously, the whole governance aspect comes in quite strongly.